In 1887, when America was still finding its identity in the aftermath of the Civil War, society had little patience for those who couldn't keep up. The homeless were seen not as victims of circumstance, but as moral failures, deserving of punishment. In the growing town of Fort Worth, Texas, where cattle drives met railroad tracks and fortunes were made overnight, there was no room for weakness. But what happens when society's cruelest judgment meets an unexpected act of human compassion? When the very people deemed civilized become the savages, and those labeled as wild show the truest humanity, this is the story of Margaret O'Sullivan, a 28-year-old Irish immigrant who lost everything in a single devastating week, and Joseph Running Bear, a Comanche man who had already lost more than most could imagine. Their paths crossed in the most unlikely place, through the iron bars of a cage designed to punish the poor for the crime of having nowhere to go. What followed would challenge everything the town thought it knew about civilization, justice, and the true meaning of freedom. Margaret O'Sullivan had once believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. She had arrived in Fort Worth 3 years earlier with her husband Patrick and their young son Tommy, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and dreams of building a better life in America. Patrick had found work at the stockyards, loading cattle onto the trains that would carry Texas beef to hungry cities across the nation. Margaret took in washing and sewing, her skilled hands earning enough to pay rent on a small room above Murphy's general store. Their life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Every evening, Patrick would return home, smelling of dust and cattle, his face tired but smiling, as Tommy ran to greet him. Margaret would serve them simple meals of beans and cornbread, and they would talk about their plans. Maybe they could save enough to buy a small piece of land. Maybe Tommy could go to school longer than either of his parents had. Maybe America would keep its promise of opportunity for those willing to work for it. Then the fever came. It started with Tommy, who woke up one morning burning hot and shivering at the same time. Margaret pressed cool cloths to his forehead and spooned lukewarm broth between his cracked lips, but the fever wouldn't break. By the third day, Patrick was showing the same symptoms. Margaret ran between her husband and son, trying to care for both, while fighting off her own growing exhaustion and fear. The doctor cost money they didn't have, but Margaret sold her mother's silver locket anyway. Doctor Williams was a kind man who did what he could, but medicine in 1887 had its limits. He left bottles of tonic and words of comfort, but both Patrick and Tommy grew worse. The fever took Tommy first, on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning when the sky seemed to weep along with Margaret's broken heart. Patrick followed 3 days later, calling out his son's name with his final breath. Margaret buried her husband and child in the Fort Worth cemetery, spending the last of their savings on simple wooden caskets and a preacher's words. She stood alone at their graves as rain turned the freshly dug earth to mud, her black dress the only thing of value she had left in the world. Without Patrick's income, Margaret couldn't pay the rent. Murphy was sympathetic but firm. He had his own family to think about. She had 1 week to find the money or find somewhere else to go. Margaret took on every washing and sewing job she could find, working from dawn until her fingers bled. But it wasn't enough. Women's work paid a fraction of what men earned, and there were more desperate people than available jobs. When the week ended, Margaret found herself on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back and the growing certainty that she had nowhere to turn. She spent her first night sleeping in the alley behind the general store, huddled against the cold brick wall and jumping at every sound. The second night, she tried the church, but Reverend Thompson explained that the church could only provide temporary shelter to respectable women, and Margaret's appearance was becoming less respectable by the day. Fort Worth had a solution for people like Margaret, though it was hardly a merciful one. The town had recently constructed what they called the vagrant cage, an iron box barely large enough for a person to lie down in, placed prominently in the town square as both punishment and warning. Those caught sleeping in doorways or begging for food would spend 3 days and nights in the cage, exposed to weather and the stares and jeers of passers-by, before being given a choice: leave town immediately or face a longer stay in the county jail. Margaret lasted 2 weeks living rough before Sheriff Coleman found her sleeping behind the hotel. She was thin, dirty, and clearly desperate, but she faced him with as much dignity as she could muster. She explained about Patrick and Tommy, about losing her home, about trying to find work. Coleman wasn't a cruel man by nature, but the law was the law, and the good citizens of Fort Worth had made their feelings clear about vagrants in their streets. The cage stood 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, made of thick iron bars with a roof that provided minimal protection from rain or sun. A bucket in the corner served for necessities, and the prisoners' meals consisted of bread and water passed through the bars twice a day. The whole apparatus sat on a raised platform in the center of town square, ensuring maximum visibility and humiliation. Margaret's first day in the cage was the longest of her life. Children threw small stones and called her names their parents had taught them. Women in fine dresses crossed to the other side of the square rather than walk too close, pulling their skirts away as if poverty might be contagious. Men made crude jokes about what a woman might do to earn her way out of such a predicament. Margaret sat in the center of the cage, her back straight and her eyes focused on something far beyond the bars, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. The summer heat was brutal during the day, but the nights brought their own misery. The iron bars grew cold and Margaret's thin dress provided little protection. She dozed fitfully, waking every time someone passed by or whenever the night sounds of the town startled her. By the second day, her lips were cracked from thirst and her skin was burned from the sun. By the third day, she was no longer sure if the voices calling her names were real or just echoes in her fevered mind. It was on that third evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky red over the Texas plains, that Joseph Running Bear first saw her. Joseph had come to town to trade horses, as he did every few months. The Comanche had been forced onto the reservation years ago, but some trading with the white settlements was still permitted under careful supervision. Joseph was one of the few trusted to make these trips, partly because he spoke English well, and partly because he had already lost so much that the white authorities didn't see him as a threat. He had been married once to a woman named Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom. They had lived in the traditional way on the plains, following the buffalo herds and raising their 2 children according to the customs their ancestors had followed for generations. But the buffalo were gone now, killed by white hunters until the vast herds that once covered the plains like brown rivers were reduced to scattered bones bleaching in the sun. The people had been forced onto reservations, confined to small parcels of land that grew smaller every year as more settlers arrived demanding more space. Ayana and their children had died during the second winter on the reservation, victims of disease and malnutrition in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Joseph had buried them according to Comanche custom, placing their bodies on platforms high above the ground so their spirits could find their way to the afterlife. But part of his own spirit had died with them, and now he moved through the world like a ghost himself, going through the motions of living without really being alive. As he led his horses through the town square, heading for the livery stable where he would complete his trading, Joseph's attention was caught by the crowd gathered around the cage. At first he assumed it was some kind of entertainment, perhaps a traveling show or demonstration, but as he drew closer he realized what he was seeing, and his step slowed. Inside the iron bars sat a woman, clearly white but as trapped and desperate as any Comanche warrior who had ever been captured in battle. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her dress was torn and stained. But there was something in the way she held herself, even in defeat, that reminded Joseph of his wife's quiet strength in the face of impossible circumstances. The crowd around the cage was enjoying the spectacle. Well-dressed townspeople pointed and laughed, their children mimicking their parents' behavior. Joseph heard someone say that the woman had been there for 3 days and would be released tomorrow if she promised to leave town immediately. Another voice wondered aloud where a woman like that could possibly go, and the laughter that followed was not kind. Joseph understood that laughter. He had heard it before, directed at his own people when they were paraded through towns, like curious animals or dangerous criminals. He had seen the way white people looked at Indians, sometimes with fear, sometimes with disgust, always with the assumption that they were somehow less than human. Now he was seeing that same treatment directed at one of their own, a white woman whose only crime was having nowhere to go. That night, Joseph made camp outside of town rather than staying at the boarding house where traveling traders usually slept. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the cage, about the way the crowd had treated her suffering as entertainment. In the darkness, staring up at stars that looked the same whether you were free or captive, rich or poor, white or Indian, Joseph made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, as the sheriff prepared to release Margaret from the cage and escort her to the edge of town with a warning never to return, Joseph Running Bear walked into the town square with a proposal that left everyone stunned into silence. He had spent the early morning hours completing his horse trading, converting his animals into the white man's money. Now he stood before Sheriff Coleman with a leather pouch full of silver coins, more money than most people in Fort Worth saw in a month. His English was careful but clear, each word chosen with precision. He wanted to pay the woman's fine, he said. He wanted to take responsibility for her welfare. He had money enough to ensure she wouldn't be a burden on the town. and land enough to give her a place to stay. All he asked was that she be released into his custody, rather than simply turned out onto the plains to starve. The crowd that had gathered to watch Margaret's final humiliation now buzzed with confusion and excitement. An Indian wanting to help a white woman? A savage offering to take care of one of their own? Some voices called it improper, others called it suspicious. A few wondered if there might be some romantic intention behind the offer, and their speculation grew crude and loud. Margaret herself said nothing during this discussion. She sat in the cage listening to her fate being debated by strangers, feeling like a piece of property being bargained over at auction. Part of her wanted to refuse any help that came with such strings attached. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through 3 days of public humiliation, knew that she had no other options. Winter was coming, and the frontier was no place for a woman alone with no money and no resources. Sheriff Coleman was in an impossible position. The law said the woman had to leave town, but it didn't specify how or with whom. Joseph Running Bear was known to the authorities as a peaceful man who had never caused trouble. His offer would solve the immediate problem of what to do with Margaret while satisfying the town's demand that she be removed from their streets. And the money he offered was real, more than enough to cover any fines or costs. After much discussion with the town council, Coleman agreed to the arrangement. Margaret O'Sullivan would be released into the custody of Joseph Running Bear, who would take her to the reservation where he lived and ensure she didn't return to Fort Worth to cause further problems. It wasn't a perfect solution for anyone, but it was a solution nonetheless. As the cage door swung open for the first time in 3 days, Margaret stepped out on unsteady legs, her body stiff from confinement and her mind reeling from this unexpected turn of events. She looked up at the tall, weathered man who had just purchased her freedom, trying to read something in his dark eyes that might tell her what he expected in return. Joseph said nothing as she emerged from the cage, but he offered her his hand to steady herself as she stepped down from the platform. His touch was gentle, and Margaret felt no threat in it, only kindness from a source she never could have expected. Around them, the crowd continued to murmur and speculate, but for the first time in days, Margaret felt like she could breathe freely. As they walked together toward the edge of town, Joseph leading his horse and Margaret struggling to keep up on legs weakened by her ordeal, neither of them spoke.
They were both people who had lost everything they held dear, thrown together by circumstances neither could have imagined.
Behind them, the iron cage stood empty in the town square, waiting for the next person whose only crime was having nowhere to go. The sun was rising over the Texas plains as they left Fort Worth behind, painting the sky the color of hope and new beginnings. Margaret didn't know what lay ahead for her in this strange arrangement with a man she didn't know, from a culture she didn't understand. But for the first time since Patrick and Tommy had died, she was walking away from her past instead of being trapped by it. Joseph glanced back once at the town that had caged a woman for being homeless, then forward at the endless expanse of prairie ahead. He had acted on instinct, driven by memories of his own people's suffering and a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the boundaries others had drawn. Now he had to figure out what came next for both of them. The rescue had been the easy part. Learning to live together would be the real challenge. The journey to the reservation took 2 days, and Margaret learned more about Joseph Running Bear in those 48 hours than she had learned about some people she had known for years. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. When Margaret stumbled from exhaustion, he offered her his horse without hesitation. When she shivered in the cool evening air, he gave her his blanket and built up the fire. When she grew faint from hunger, having eaten nothing but bread and water for 3 days, he shared his dried meat and showed her which plants along the trail were safe to eat. Joseph had prepared for this journey more carefully than Margaret realized. Before approaching the sheriff, he had spent hours considering what would happen after her release. He couldn't simply take her to the reservation without preparation. The Indian agent would ask questions, and many of the Comanche would be suspicious of a white woman suddenly appearing in their midst. He needed a story that would satisfy both groups, and more importantly, he needed a plan that would actually work. As they sat by their campfire on the first night, Joseph finally explained what he was offering. His voice was quiet but steady as he spoke in the careful English he had learned from missionaries and government officials. Margaret would come to the reservation as his wife, he said. It was the only arrangement that would make sense to both the white authorities and his own people. She would have protection, a place to live, and food to eat. In return, she would help him with the work that needed to be done: cooking, cleaning, tending to the small garden plot he was allowed to cultivate. Margaret stared into the fire as he spoke, her mind racing. Marriage to a man she barely knew, from a culture she understood even less? It seemed impossible, terrifying, completely outside anything she had ever imagined for her life. But the alternative was equally clear. She had nowhere else to go, no other options available to her. The frontier was harsh to everyone, but it was especially brutal to women alone. She asked him why he had helped her, why he had been willing to spend his money on a stranger who could offer him nothing in return. Joseph was quiet for a long time before answering. He told her about Ayana, about their children, about watching his family waste away in the squalid conditions of the reservation, while white officials promised help that never came. He told her about the loneliness that had consumed him since their deaths, about feeling like a ghost walking through the world with no purpose. When he saw her in that cage, he said he saw something he recognized, a person whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond their control, someone society had decided didn't matter. He couldn't save his own family, but perhaps he could save her. Perhaps in helping her, he might find some reason to keep living himself. Margaret was touched by his honesty, but she was also practical enough to ask hard questions. What would happen if this arrangement didn't work? What if the other Comanche rejected her? What if the Indian agent became suspicious? What if she couldn't adapt to life on the reservation? Joseph considered each question carefully before answering. If the arrangement failed, he would help her reach one of the larger cities where she might find work and disappear into anonymity. If his people rejected her, he would live apart from the main settlement and protect her as best he could. If the agent became suspicious, they would present themselves as a married couple and stick to their story consistently. As for adaptation, he would teach her what she needed to know, but ultimately that would be up to her own strength and determination. The conversation continued late into the night, with Margaret asking questions about Comanche customs and Joseph explaining the realities of reservation life. It would not be easy, he warned her. The government provided inadequate food rations that often arrived late or spoiled. The land they had been given was poor for farming, and hunting was restricted. Many of his people struggled with despair and the white man's whiskey, trying to forget what they had lost. But there was also beauty in the traditional ways that survived, wisdom in the old stories, and strength in the bonds between families who had endured together. By morning, Margaret had made her decision. She would go with Joseph to the reservation and try to make this impossible arrangement work. She had buried her husband and son, survived homelessness and imprisonment, and faced public humiliation without breaking completely. If she could endure all that, perhaps she could learn to live among people who had endured even greater losses. The reservation, when they finally reached it, was both better and worse than Margaret had expected. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, a clear stream running through the valley, endless sky stretching to the horizon. But the buildings were another story. The government had constructed a few official structures, the agent's office, a schoolhouse, a building that served as both church and meeting hall. The Comanche lived in a mixture of traditional teepees and crude wooden cabins, depending on their personal preferences and what materials they could obtain. Joseph's home was a small cabin he had built himself, combining white construction techniques with traditional design elements that made the space feel more familiar to him. It had one main room with a fireplace, a sleeping area separated by a hanging blanket, and a small kitchen area with a table he had crafted by hand. Outside was a garden plot where he grew corn, beans, and squash, using seeds his grandmother had saved from before the reservation years. Their arrival caused quite a stir in the community. Word spread quickly that Joseph had returned from his trading trip with a white woman, and people came to see for themselves what this meant. Margaret stood close to Joseph as curious faces gathered around them, trying to appear calm despite her nervousness. The conversations around her were in Comanche, but she could read the expressions and gestures well enough to know that opinions were divided. Some of the older women looked at her with suspicion, clearly wondering what kind of white woman would end up in such circumstances. Some of the men seemed amused by the situation, making comments that caused others to laugh or shake their heads. But Margaret also saw faces that showed sympathy, particularly among some of the women who seemed to understand that survival sometimes required making choices that others might not understand. The most important person to convince was James Whitehorse, the elected leader of this particular band of Comanche. He was a man in his 50s who had fought in the old days, but now worked to help his people navigate the complex politics of reservation life. He spoke English fluently and served as an intermediary between the Comanche and the Indian agent, a role that required careful diplomacy and political skill. Whitehorse listened carefully as Joseph explained the situation, describing it as a marriage between two people who had both lost their families and found companionship with each other. He presented Margaret as a woman of good character, who had fallen on hard times through no fault of her own. emphasizing her willingness to work and contribute to the community. Most importantly, he assured Whitehorse that Margaret understood she was now part of the Comanche community and would respect their customs and leadership. The conversation took place in a mixture of English and Comanche, with Joseph translating when necessary. Margaret answered Whitehorse's questions as honestly as she could, explaining about Patrick and Tommy, about losing her home, about her determination to build a new life despite everything that had happened to her. She could see him evaluating her responses, trying to determine whether she was someone who could be trusted or someone who might bring trouble to his people. Finally, Whitehorse gave his provisional approval for the arrangement. Margaret could stay, but she would be watched carefully. Any sign that she was a spy for the government or that her presence was causing problems for the community, and she would have to leave immediately. Joseph was personally responsible for her behavior, and both of them would be held accountable if anything went wrong. With that settled, the real work began. Joseph started teaching Margaret the basics of life on the reservation, beginning with the most practical concerns. Water had to be carried from the stream, and he showed her the best times to go and how to purify it for drinking. Firewood had to be gathered regularly, and he taught her to recognize which types of wood burned best and how to split logs safely. Food preparation required learning about new ingredients and cooking methods, particularly ways to make government rations more palatable and nutritious. But beyond the practical lessons, Margaret also had to learn about Comanche customs and social expectations. Joseph explained the importance of respecting elders, the proper ways to greet people, the topics that should and shouldn't be discussed in public. He taught her basic phrases in Comanche and helped her understand the subtle social signals that governed interactions within the community. The language barrier was initially overwhelming. Margaret had never heard anything like Comanche before, with its complex tonal variations and grammatical structures that seemed completely foreign to her Irish-influenced English. But she was motivated to learn, spending hours each day practicing with Joseph and gradually picking up essential vocabulary. The children in the community became her unexpected teachers, giggling at her pronunciation mistakes but patiently correcting her and celebrating her progress. As weeks turned into months, Margaret began to find her place in the reservation community. She proved herself useful with tasks that drew on skills she had developed in her previous life: sewing and mending clothes, caring for sick children, helping with food preparation for community gatherings. Her willingness to work hard and her respectful attitude toward Comanche customs gradually won over most of the initial skeptics. The relationship with Joseph evolved slowly and carefully. They had entered into this arrangement as strangers brought together by desperation, but they gradually developed genuine respect and affection for each other. Joseph appreciated Margaret's resilience and determination to adapt to such dramatically different circumstances. Margaret came to admire Joseph's quiet wisdom, his deep love for his people's traditions, and his ability to find hope despite tremendous personal loss. Their marriage ceremony, when it finally took place, was a blend of traditions that reflected their unique situation. The Comanche elements honored Joseph's heritage and his standing in the community, while Christian elements acknowledged Margaret's background and satisfied any white observers who might question the legitimacy of their union. It was a small gathering, attended mainly by close friends and family members who had come to accept this unusual partnership. But even as Margaret found stability and acceptance in her new life, larger forces were gathering that would soon test everything she and Joseph had built together. The federal government was implementing new policies toward Native Americans, policies that would bring increased scrutiny and pressure to reservations across the country. Land speculators were eyeing reservation territory with growing hunger, supported by politicians who argued that Indians weren't making productive use of their allotted lands. Christian missionaries were arriving with increasing frequency, determined to stamp out traditional customs and replace them with white civilization. Margaret began to notice changes in the community as these pressures mounted. Young people were being sent away to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak Comanche or practice traditional customs. Government agents were visiting more frequently, asking pointed questions about land use and community organization. Some families were beginning to talk about accepting individual land allotments and breaking up the reservation system entirely, hoping that assimilation might protect their children's futures, even if it meant abandoning their cultural heritage. Joseph watched these developments with growing concern. He had seen how government promises to his people had been broken repeatedly over the years, and he was suspicious of any new proposals that claimed to offer better conditions. But he also recognized that the old ways of life were disappearing whether the Comanche cooperated with the government or not. The question was whether they could find ways to preserve what mattered most while adapting enough to survive in a world that seemed determined to eliminate them entirely. Margaret found herself in a unique position to understand both perspectives. She had experienced firsthand how white society treated those it deemed unworthy, but she was also learning to see the world through Comanche eyes and appreciate the wisdom and beauty of traditional ways. Her mixed loyalties sometimes made her feel like she belonged fully to neither world, but they also gave her insights that proved valuable when tensions began to rise. The crisis that would test everyone came in the form of a new Indian agent named William Morrison, a man who arrived at the reservation with firm ideas about what needed to change and little patience for anyone who disagreed with him. Morrison represented a new generation of government officials who believed that traditional Indian ways were obstacles to progress that needed to be eliminated as quickly as possible. He looked at the reservation and saw inefficiency, superstition, and wasted resources that could be put to better use. Morrison's first target was the traditional council system that allowed the Comanche to govern many of their own affairs. He announced that all decisions would now be made by the Indian agent in consultation with a small group of appointed leaders who had proven their commitment to civilization and progress. Traditional ceremonies were banned as heathen practices that interfered with Christian education. The Comanche language was forbidden in the government school, with children punished for speaking anything other than English. Most significantly for Joseph and Margaret, Morrison announced a new policy requiring all marriages on the reservation to be officially sanctioned by white authorities and performed according to Christian customs. Any couple not married in the eyes of white law would be separated, with the woman relocated to a different reservation or sent to work in white households where she could learn proper domestic skills. This policy was clearly aimed at disrupting traditional Comanche marriage customs, but it also threatened couples like Joseph and Margaret, whose unusual circumstances didn't fit neatly into official categories. Their ceremony had been recognized by the Comanche community, but had not been registered with white authorities, making their union vulnerable to Morrison's interference. When Margaret realized the implications of the new policy, she felt the same helpless terror she had experienced while trapped in the cage in Fort Worth. Once again, forces beyond her control were threatening to destroy the life she had worked so hard to build. But this time she wasn't alone, and this time she had learned something about finding strength in the face of impossible circumstances. The fight to protect their marriage and their community was about to begin, and it would require every bit of courage and wisdom both Joseph and Margaret had gained from their respective journeys through loss and survival. The cage in Fort Worth had been made of iron bars, but the constraints Morrison represented were even more dangerous because they came disguised as civilization and progress. As summer turned to autumn on the reservation, Joseph and Margaret prepared for the battle of their lives, knowing that failure would mean not just separation from each other, but the destruction of everything the Comanche community had managed to preserve of their traditional way of life. The stakes had never been higher, and the enemy had never been more powerful. But they had also never been more determined to fight for their right to exist on their own terms. The real test of their marriage was about to begin. William Morrison arrived at the reservation with the confidence of a man who believed completely in his own righteousness. He had spent 5 years working with Indian communities in other states, and in his view, he had seen firsthand how traditional customs held Native peoples back from achieving their full potential as productive American citizens. What he interpreted as progress, however, the Comanche experienced as a systematic assault on everything that made their lives meaningful. Margaret watched Morrison during his first community meeting and recognized something familiar in his manner. The same cold certainty she had seen in the faces of the Fort Worth citizens who had watched her suffer in the cage. It was the expression of people who had decided that their way was the only acceptable way, and that anyone who disagreed simply needed to be corrected or removed. She had learned to be wary of such people, because they were capable of great cruelty while convincing themselves they were being helpful. Morrison's first official act was to post new regulations throughout the reservation, written in English only, despite the fact that many of the older Comanche could not read. The rules covered everything from marriage and family structure to religious practices and economic activities. Traditional healing ceremonies were banned as dangerous superstition. Children would be required to attend the government school year-round, with no time off for seasonal activities or family obligations. All trade and business dealings had to be approved in advance by the Indian agent. Most concerning for Joseph and Margaret, the new marriage regulations required all couples to undergo a formal Christian ceremony performed by the government-appointed minister within 60 days, or face immediate separation. Any children from unauthorized unions would be removed from their parents and placed in government boarding schools for their own protection and proper education. The deadline created panic throughout the community. Many Comanche couples had been married according to traditional customs that had no equivalent in white law. Some had been together for decades, raising children and grandchildren in relationships that were considered sacred and permanent within their own culture. but were now deemed invalid by government standards. The thought of being forced to abandon their customs or lose their families created a level of stress and fear that Margaret could see affecting everyone's daily life. Joseph called a meeting with James Whitehorse and several other community leaders to discuss how they should respond to Morrison's ultimatum. The conversation took place in Joseph's cabin, with Margaret listening from the kitchen area while she prepared food for the gathering. The discussion was conducted primarily in Comanche, but Margaret had learned enough of the language by now to follow the general flow of the arguments. Some voices argued for compliance, pointing out that resistance had never worked well for Native peoples in conflicts with the federal government. They suggested that performing the required ceremonies might be acceptable if they could still maintain their traditional beliefs privately. Others insisted that submitting to these demands would be the beginning of the end for their culture, and that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. Whitehorse was torn between his responsibilities as a leader. He had spent years learning to navigate the complex politics of dealing with white authorities, finding ways to protect his people while avoiding direct confrontation that might bring harsh retaliation. But Morrison represented a level of interference that went beyond anything they had faced before, and Whitehorse was beginning to wonder if accommodation was still possible. As the debate continued, Margaret found herself thinking about her own situation. She and Joseph had found a way to build a genuine partnership despite the unusual circumstances that brought them together. Their relationship had grown from mutual need into something deeper, not the passionate romance of her marriage to Patrick, but a steady companionship based on shared values and mutual respect. The thought of being separated by government decree filled her with the anger that surprised her with its intensity. When the formal discussion ended and the other men had left, Margaret sat down with Joseph to talk through their options. They could comply with Morrison's demand and undergo a Christian wedding ceremony, which would satisfy the legal requirements but would also mean accepting the authority of a system that viewed their original Comanche ceremony as illegitimate. They could refuse to comply and face separation, with Margaret likely being sent away from the reservation permanently. Or they could find some way to resist that didn't involve direct confrontation with federal authorities. Joseph was reluctant to submit to Morrison's demands, not because of pride, but because he understood the larger implications. If the community gave in on this issue, it would establish a precedent that would make it easier for Morrison to eliminate other traditional practices. Every compromise would lead to demands for further compromises until nothing remained of the Comanche way of life except what white authorities deemed acceptable. But Margaret pointed out that refusing to comply would accomplish nothing if it simply resulted in their separation and her removal from the community. The important thing was to find a way to protect their relationship while also taking a stand that might benefit the broader community. What they needed was a strategy that would expose the fundamental unfairness of Morrison's policies while making it difficult for him to retaliate effectively. The solution they developed was both simple and brilliant. Margaret would publicly request a meeting with Morrison to discuss her situation, claiming that she was confused about the new regulations and wanted to ensure compliance. During this meeting, she would ask specific questions that would force Morrison to clarify exactly what the government's policies meant and how they would be enforced. Joseph would arrange for several community members to witness this conversation, including some who spoke English fluently and could later report Morrison's exact words to others. The goal was to get Morrison to state clearly, in front of witnesses, that the government considered traditional Comanche marriages to be invalid and that couples who refused to undergo Christian ceremonies would be forcibly separated. They wanted him to admit that children would be taken from their parents and that the economic livelihood of families could be destroyed for refusing to abandon their cultural practices. In short, they wanted to trick him into revealing the full extent of his authoritarian intentions. Margaret prepared carefully for this meeting, drawing on her experience of dealing with various white officials during her time of homelessness. She understood that men like Morrison responded well to apparent deference and submission, especially from women, and that they could often be manipulated into revealing more than they intended if they believed they were dealing with someone who posed no threat. The meeting took place in Morrison's office, with Margaret playing the role of a confused and anxious white woman who had somehow become entangled with Indians and desperately wanted to do the right thing. She explained that she had married Joseph according to Comanche custom, but was now worried that this might not be sufficient in the eyes of white law. She asked innocent-sounding questions about what would happen to couples who couldn't afford the fees for Christian ceremonies, or who didn't understand English well enough to participate meaningfully in such services. Morrison took the bait completely, launching into a lengthy explanation of why traditional Indian customs were primitive and insufficient for civilized people. He assured Margaret that the government's policies were for her own protection, explaining that Indian men often abandoned their wives when it suited them because their marriages weren't really binding in any legal sense. By requiring Christian ceremonies, The government was protecting women and children from this kind of irresponsible behavior. When Margaret asked what would happen to couples who refused to comply, Morrison became even more expansive. He explained that such people were clearly not ready for the responsibilities of civilization and would need to be separated so they could receive proper education. The women would be sent to work with Christian families where they could learn appropriate domestic skills, while the men would be given the choice of compliance or removal from the reservation entirely. Children would be placed in boarding schools where they could be raised properly, without the negative influence of traditional customs. Most damaging of all, Morrison explained that property and land rights would be tied to legal marriage status. Couples who weren't properly married according to white law couldn't own property jointly, couldn't inherit from each other, and couldn't make decisions about their children's education or medical care. The government would appoint guardians for any children whose parents were deemed unfit due to their adherence to primitive customs. Margaret listened to all of this with apparent gratitude, thanking Morrison for his patience in explaining the regulations to someone who clearly needed guidance. She assured him that she and Joseph would certainly comply with all requirements and that she hoped other couples would follow their example once they understood how beneficial the new policies would be for everyone involved. But the witnesses hidden near Morrison's office heard every word, and within hours the entire community knew exactly what compliance with the new regulations would mean. Morrison had essentially admitted that the government intended to destroy traditional Comanche family structures entirely, replacing them with white Christian alternatives, whether people wanted this change or not. The threat wasn't limited to marriage ceremonies. It extended to every aspect of family life, property ownership, and cultural identity. The community response was swift and decisive. Instead of individual couples trying to decide whether to comply with Morrison's ultimatum, the entire community would act together. They would all refuse to undergo the required Christian ceremonies, forcing Morrison to either back down or attempt to separate every family on the reservation simultaneously. This strategy was dangerous but smart. Morrison had the legal authority to enforce his regulations, but he lacked the practical resources to deal with complete non-compliance from an entire community. The nearest military post was 3 days away, and the soldiers there were already spread thin dealing with other problems. Morrison had assumed that most people would comply if faced with serious consequences, making it easy to deal harshly with a few holdouts. He hadn't prepared for the possibility that everyone would resist together. The deadline passed with 0 couples requesting Christian ceremonies. Morrison was furious, but initially tried to maintain his authority by targeting a few families he considered most vulnerable. He ordered that 3 couples be separated immediately and used as examples to encourage compliance from the others. But when he tried to implement these orders, he discovered that the entire community had prepared for this response. The families targeted for separation had moved in with relatives, making it impossible to find specific individuals without searching every building on the reservation. Community members claimed they didn't know where the targeted families had gone, and since many of the government records were incomplete or inaccurate, Morrison couldn't prove they were lying. When he threatened to call in military assistance, Whitehorse calmly pointed out that this would require Morrison to explain to his superiors why his policies had provoked such widespread resistance. Meanwhile, Margaret had been busy with another part of their strategy. Using her knowledge of white society and her connections from her previous life, she had written letters to newspapers in Fort Worth and Dallas, describing the situation on the reservation and Morrison's policies. She presented herself as a concerned white woman who had married into the Comanche community and was witnessing the government's attempts to destroy native families through bureaucratic manipulation. Her letters were carefully crafted to appeal to white readers' sense of fairness and their romantic notions about marriage and family. She described elderly Comanche couples who had been together for 40 or 50 years being told that their marriages were invalid, and children being threatened with removal from loving homes because their parents refused to abandon their cultural traditions. She painted Morrison as a petty bureaucrat who was using his power to torment innocent people rather than helping them achieve genuine progress. The letters struck a nerve with readers who were already suspicious of government overreach and sympathetic to stories about families being torn apart by official interference. Several newspapers picked up Margaret's story, and soon editorial writers across Texas were questioning whether Morrison's policies represented appropriate use of federal authority or dangerous government intrusion into private family matters. The negative publicity created problems for Morrison's superiors in Washington, who were already dealing with criticism from humanitarian groups concerned about conditions on Indian reservations. Morrison's heavy-handed approach was generating exactly the kind of attention that government officials preferred to avoid, especially since it involved a white woman who could speak eloquently about the situation to white audiences. Under pressure from multiple directions, Morrison's superiors began looking for a face-saving way to resolve the situation. They couldn't simply abandon their policies without appearing weak, but they also couldn't afford to escalate the conflict further without risking more negative publicity. The solution they developed was to transfer Morrison to a different position and replace him with an agent who would be more flexible in implementing government regulations. The new agent, Thomas Hawkins, arrived with instructions to resolve the marriage controversy without creating further problems. He was an experienced diplomat who understood that successful administration of Indian reservations required finding ways to satisfy government requirements while allowing communities to maintain enough of their traditional ways to prevent widespread resistance. Hawkins met privately with Whitehorse and other community leaders to work out a compromise that both sides could accept. The Comanche would agree to have their traditional marriages officially recorded in government records, with ceremonies that included certain Christian elements but also incorporated traditional customs. Couples who were already married according to Comanche law would be recognized as legally married without having to undergo new ceremonies, though they could choose to have Christian weddings if they preferred. The compromise wasn't perfect for anyone, but it avoided the worst outcomes that both sides had feared. The Comanche maintained recognition of their traditional marriage customs while satisfying government requirements for official documentation. The federal authorities could claim that they had successfully brought reservation marriages into compliance with white legal standards while avoiding the massive disruption that would have resulted from Morrison's approach. For Joseph and Margaret personally, the resolution meant they could continue their life together without fear of government interference. Their relationship had been tested by the crisis and had emerged stronger, proving to both of them that they had built something worth fighting for. Margaret had also found a new role for herself within the community, using her unique position as a white woman who understood both cultures to serve as an interpreter and advocate when conflicts arose with government officials. The victory was significant, but also temporary. The fundamental tensions between traditional Native American ways and government policies aimed at forced assimilation remained unresolved. Morrison's replacement was more diplomatic but no less committed to the long-term goal of eliminating traditional customs and replacing them with white Christian alternatives. The fight Joseph and Margaret had helped win was just one battle in a much longer war, but sometimes individual battles matter enormously, even when they don't resolve larger conflicts permanently. The successful resistance to Morrison's marriage policies demonstrated to the Comanche community that organized opposition could work, even against seemingly overwhelming government authority. It showed that careful strategy and preparation could sometimes overcome raw power, and that allies could be found in unexpected places. For Margaret, the experience completed her transformation from homeless victim to empowered advocate. She had found not just survival, but purpose in her new life, using her skills and knowledge to benefit a community that had accepted her despite her outsider status. Her journey from the cage in Fort Worth to a leadership role on the Comanche reservation was a testament to human resilience and the possibility of building meaningful connections across cultural boundaries. Joseph, meanwhile, had found a way to honor his late wife's memory while building a new life with Margaret. His decision to help a stranger in desperate circumstances had not only saved her life, but had also given him a renewed sense of purpose and connection to his community. The loneliness and despair that had consumed him after his family's death had been replaced by hope and determination to protect what remained of his people's way of life. Their marriage continued to evolve over the years that followed, deepening into a partnership that combined the practical necessity that had brought them together with genuine love and respect. They never had children of their own, but they served as foster parents and mentors to many young people in the community, helping to bridge the gap between traditional ways and the changing world they all had to navigate. Margaret lived on the reservation for the rest of her life, becoming fluent in Comanche and eventually serving as an unofficial historian who helped preserve traditional stories and customs for future generations. Her letters and journals, written over more than 30 years, would eventually provide valuable documentation of life on the reservation during a critical period of transition and change. Joseph became one of the most respected leaders in the community, known for his wisdom in dealing with government officials and his commitment to preserving Comanche traditions while helping his people adapt to changing circumstances. He served as an interpreter and negotiator in dozens of conflicts over the years, always working to find solutions that protected both individual families and the broader community. When Margaret died in 1923, she was mourned by the entire reservation community as one of their own. Her funeral combined Christian and Comanche elements, reflecting the dual heritage she had embraced and the bridge she had built between two very different worlds. Joseph followed her 3 years later, and they were buried side by side in the reservation cemetery, their shared headstone marking the resting place of two people who had found love and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. Their story became part of the oral tradition of the Comanche community, passed down as an example of how courage and compassion could triumph over hatred and prejudice. But perhaps more importantly, Their marriage proved that genuine human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose, and that love could flourish even in soil that seemed too barren to support new growth. The iron cage that had imprisoned Margaret in Fort Worth had been designed to break her spirit and force her into submission. Instead, it had led her to a man who understood the true meaning of freedom. Not the absence of constraints, but the presence of connections that made life meaningful despite all the constraints that existed. Together they had built something that neither could have achieved alone. A life that honored both their individual histories and their shared future, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create the most lasting legacies.